Recording this. Okay, perfect. Dr. Brittingham has worked as County Health and Human Services Planning Coordinator, providing assistance in disaster and emergency planning for vulnerable populations. She provided subject matter expertise to the Delaware Division of Public Health on people with disabilities and access and functional needs for emergency management planning, response, and recovery processes. Currently, Dr. Brittingham is an associate scientist at the University of Delaware's Center for Drug and Health Studies and is the principal investigator for the Center for Disease Control and Prevention's Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance Surveys and the State of Delaware's Division of Public Health's Youth Tobacco Survey. She is the co-principal investigator on the Assessment of Human Trafficking Victims Project, the first of its kind in Delaware, designed to estimate the prevalence of human trafficking in the state. She earned a bachelor's degree in psychology with a minor in sociology from Millersville University, a master's degree in public administration with a concentration in emergency management from the University of North Texas, and a doctorate in urban affairs and public policy from the University of Delaware. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Brittingham.
Hi, thank you guys so much for having me. I also want to thank Amber especially for following up and collecting my bio and the presentation. I know a lot of work goes into everything every semester to get things scheduled, so I very much appreciate it. Based on the number of folks who are participating right now, I'm going to start the presentation, and if you have questions, feel free to put something in the chat box or just raise your hand. We can do questions as we go along. If it becomes too onerous, we'll just wait and we'll do them at the end. But for those of you who may not have had my class, I'm the one who teaches social dimensions of disasters. And so basically it's the people portion, and it's the class at 6:05. So if I haven't had some of you yet, I look forward to interacting with you in the future. If I have had you in class before, it's possible some of this may be new. Some of it may fall back on the discussion points that we've had in class, but I tried to mix it up a little bit to make sure that I had something for everybody. Because of the people nature of what I do, the agenda today is going to be a quick timeline of FEMA, and I know many of you already know that, but I want to make sure that we keep our lens on the people and how that winds up playing out in response and recovery efforts. I want to go over a couple of watershed events and then dive a little bit more deeply into the past, present, and future of what we're seeing right now and how people wind up preparing and recovering from disasters. And so we'll hit up those three bullet areas there in terms of EM as a profession, knowledge of the population, and globalization as it stands right now. And then I'll go over some of my final thoughts, and I will turn it over to Amber to do questions. So I know many of you, especially when you in 601, and for those of you who have come out of different bachelor's programs in emergency management, kind of how FEMA came about. But as a quick overview, really it started from civil defense, right? I mean, we had World War I, World War II, that we were in an arms race with Russia, and that led to the Cold War. And so initial civil defense efforts were really focused on what happens if a nuclear warhead comes across the North Pole and, Russia or the Soviet Union at that time tries to blow up a city in the US. It obviously didn't happen. At the time, it was also quite unlikely that it was ever going to happen. But they recognized at that point that natural disasters were still happening across the US, but you had a bunch of these different agencies that would come together, and the organizational structure was so decentralized that victims of disasters were like, what is going on? I have to now go over to that agency to apply for this, and then I've got to go back over there to apply for that. And it just was not working well. So So in 1978, FEMA was created, but it was not enacted until 1979 under an executive order. And it was April of 1979 that happened. In the meanwhile, natural hazards were occurring. And in 1996, FEMA was elevated to a cabinet level position. Okay, so that meant that when the president sat down with the cabinet advisors, somebody from FEMA was there. And at the time, the focus was on natural disasters and preparedness in general. 2002, FEMA ends up absorbed into DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, and that raised its own issues, and we'll get to that in the next couple of slides. But FEMA becomes its own branch again under DHS in 2006. And so I'm sure some of you were realizing as I was going over these dates that, they kind of coincide with these watershed events. So I went back a few decades. I didn't want to list everything out, but a lot of the events there listed on the left. So Loma Prieta earthquake, Hurricanes Hugo and Andrew, and the Northridge earthquakes. That's kind of where some of the modern emergency management case studies start. And so we have these natural disasters occurring, right? And either every year, every couple of years, something's happening. And if you follow that little gold arrow over to the right, that's what FEMA is doing. And so while FEMA was stood up and enacted in 1979, and it was supposed to sort of centralize things, the response to disasters was really not great. When Hurricane Andrew hit in 1992, a number of people who really were disproportionately affected were individuals who were Spanish speaking or migrants who were Spanish speaking in and around the Miami-Dade area in Florida. And so Kate Hale, in a fairly well-known quote, says, "Where the hell is the cavalry?" at a press conference, because they were requesting all of this stuff from FEMA because local and state organizations had been overwhelmed, and FEMA just sort of wasn't able to fulfill the needs in the way that people and emergency managers felt that stuff needed to be handled. So Hurricane Andrew occurs, and then we've got the Northridge earthquake out on the West Coast in California. And at that point, it's like, okay, we need to handle this differently. We have people out in the community where needs are not being met, and we're talking about immediate needs. The event occurs and we need to bring in water. We have to figure out sanitation. We're building some of the structural integrity of services that are already there, like utility level things. And so FEMA under President Clinton is elevated to a cabinet level position. Okay, so that's what I said on the last slide. And it was really in response to some of these events that were occurring. As a side note on this, if anybody's interested in some of the race and ethnicity issues, Walter Gillis Peacock and I want to say Betty Hearn Morrow have a book. It's called Hurricane Andrew, Ethnicity, and Race. It's quite good to also identify what's going on this slide on the lower left-hand corner. That picture is one of the well-known ones, specifically on Hurricane Andrew. I happened to pull it from a USA Today source because I didn't have a personal copy of this. But this was a mobile home park after Hurricane Andrew and just sort of the complete devastation that occurred afterwards. And for anybody who's taken my class, you know that we talk about housing structures, we talk about class and wealth. And very typically, if you're living in some sort of mobile home and you don't have a built on-site house, the likelihood of you having additional money at your disposal to be able to buy either a new structure or the things you need to recover post-event is very, very low. So moving on, FEMA is now at a cabinet position, and September 11th happens, okay? And that just shook everything up. So following this little gold arrow over to the right, 2002, FEMA is absorbed into DHS, and the focus is all about terrorism, okay? But in the meanwhile, we have all of these other natural hazards or natural disasters going on. We've got Hurricane Katrina, we've got the Joplin, Missouri tornado, Hurricane Sandy, Harvey, the Camp Fire. I went ahead and just recently added the coronavirus, so COVID-19 on here. This is not necessarily the same sort of events that I've already listed, but it is very interesting with how the response is shaping up because, you know, we went from dealing with natural disasters to, hey, now we're dealing with a focus on terrorism, to we're looking at a public health response unlike anything we've seen in a while. Because of the focus on terrorism, when FEMA was sort of absorbed into DHS, it became very, very apparent very quickly that that was not going to be a long-term solution because of Hurricane Katrina. People who were disproportionately affected in Hurricane Katrina were individuals who had disabilities or individuals who identified with being Black or African American and had a lower socioeconomic status. The lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans was the epicenter of some of the worst devastation, and the individuals who lived there also had the worst, a disproportionately bad possibility of getting themselves out of that situation due to transportation, due to money, and then just the general government structure where they were not prepared for that sort of devastation. On this particular picture, this is one that I took when I did some field work after Hurricane Sandy. And so this was up in the far Rockaways. Hurricane Sandy made this list simply because there were people who were completely unprepared, especially in the New York area, for Hurricane Sandy to come up the coast and then basically park itself over the New York City area and up into the Northeast. We're not used to dealing with hurricanes in that neck of the woods. And so it was a very, very different paradigm that people ended up experiencing and having to deal with. And whether or not they were prepared was questionable. I mean, unlike in the Carolinas and Georgia and Florida, where hurricane season, you know, means something. It's like, do you have 3 days worth of food and water if you have the possibility to buy it? Do you have what it is that you need? Might have meant something different for folks in the New York City area. Rising tide levels also had something to, rising tide levels were a factor in why some people just were affected as badly as they were. But anyway, where events happen means something. So looking at how we're recognizing needs of people as an emergency management profession, you know, kind of past, present, and future. Originally, emergency management was, and it still is to a great degree, filled by members of fire service and law enforcement. Okay, so that was how it started. If you were part of the fire service, if you were a police officer, you might go into emergency management because it's like, well, I know the system, it's a very response-oriented action. I would argue that still today, it's still fairly male-dominated, and then the positions that are held within emergency management tend to be split along gender lines, and this is more of an experience and just a noticing of things, especially when I was embedded in emergency management more frequently and on a one-on-one basis. But as we've moved forward, we've also increased the number of degree programs, okay? So there's been an increase in the professionalization of the field. So we have in 1983, the first bachelor's degree at University of North Texas, and that's where you could, you know, go and get your undergrad in emergency management. And as of earlier this week, when I pulled the numbers, if you look at the Emergency Management Institute, you know, out in Emmitsburg, Maryland, they have, as long as I counted all the little bullets correctly, 80 listed bachelor's degree programs, 58 master's, and 9 doctoral programs. And that was just in emergency management. I think key elements to some of this is that we're recognizing that it's not just a we told you to, so you should mentality. There's a lot more that goes into it in terms of laws, regulations. Do you know how these two agencies or entities are allowed to work together? We've got the preparedness aspect of it, but we also have recovery, and that's gaining attention because people are still the end users to this. An emergency manager is trying to make sure that people in his or her jurisdiction are prepared, understanding that some people are not going to be able to be prepared to the same degree as others. But then recovery is that next step. Were something to happen, what does that mean for the community? Who has what, and kind of what are your big picture, like almost wish list items? Like what's going on in your community right now that you might be able to make better? And with this increase in professionalization, sometimes through the number of degree programs that are going on, because you've got people coming out of school who have certain degrees that might speak to emergency management, it might be disaster management, sometimes homeland security. I mean, those were not included in here, but it's like understanding some of the dialogues that happen with respect to these are some of the social justice issues that people are experiencing. These are the tools we would need to fix it, and this is how we would make it better. I think are where we're kind of going in the future with some of that. So the next one, knowledge of the population. Originally with emergency management being kind of top down, and knowing your neighbor, there was an element that at some point in the past, perhaps it was easier to deal with things. There were just fewer people, right? If you lived in a town, if you lived in a city, chances are you might know of somebody or know someone. But as disasters have routinely pointed out to us, they wind up highlighting vulnerable populations. So as I had mentioned a couple minutes ago, Hurricane Andrew and the migrant community, that was huge. People were like, oh my gosh, what is going on down there? Because it's possible that in their area, I mean, when you were watching the 6 o'clock news somewhere in Indiana, you might not have known that there were as many individuals who were Spanish speaking or migrants in and around the Miami area as you found out about, when you were watching this post-disaster news coverage. You've got these other watershed moments where this winds up being sort of the focusing event for some of the social structures to be looked at. It's like, did you know that these people were living, a mile over from you? We have the civil rights movement that happened in the 60s, but it got picked up again by individuals with disabilities in the early to late 1980s. And so in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. We kind of went through the 90s and there were different disasters, but I would argue that some of the same populations in terms of individuals who identified with disabilities weren't ID'd in the same way. It wasn't until Hurricane Katrina and the devastation wrought by Katrina on the disability community that there was a rallying cry there that there should be nothing about us without us. And so the idea was, if you want to know how to respond during a disaster or how to help people recover, or to some degree, even be prepared, talk to the people that are actually going to find themselves in situations where they might need additional assistance. Where are the people who don't have their own transportation? Can you find that out? Are there organizations who might know that? This was some of FEMA's movement towards whole community planning and preparedness, that who is in your community, who's going to help you inform some of your plans. We discovered after Hurricane Katrina, too, that people aren't going to leave without their pets. You know, I mean, pets for a lot of cultures are just the animals who live outside who occasionally get table scraps. And that's how dogs, for instance, are, like, you know, in India. Dogs don't come inside, they don't sleep in your bed, they're not getting special food, they don't have their own bowls, that sort of thing. And so recognizing that I have people that I'm working with or whom I'm working with who have pets, and they're not going to evacuate unless I can guarantee to them that their pets can stay with them. This can be a normal household animal like a dog or a cat or a turtle or a snake. But then you've also got these larger barnyard animals like cows, horses, chickens. I'm sure many of you have seen like the uptick in number of people who keep chickens at their homes just for the fresh eggs or for the meat. And that wasn't happening 20 or 30 years ago. What was happening then was if you had that animal, it was because you lived on a farm and that was the farm animal that stayed with you. Obviously, a cow or a horse, sometimes people don't want to leave them because it's their livelihood. But it's also, these animals are expensive, right? I mean, if you've bought it the first time because you want a horse to ride, because you do that, you know, as a hobby on the weekends or after work, you become attached to the animal. And so emergency managers really have had to think about, you know, how do we meet people where they are in this respect? Because we want them to evacuate and stay safe. We need them to evacuate and stay safe. But how are we going to be able to provide for both them and what they find is really important? But with that comes this difficulty, okay? I would argue now that it is more difficult to know who's in your community because people are becoming socially isolated. Sometimes that has to do with advancing age. Sometimes it's technology. If you walk down the street, individuals are on their smartphones. They're not looking up in traffic, or they're just passing each other. And they could know the person that they're passing, but it's not like a, hey, how are you? You know, they're reading something on their phone or texting. And so trying to make sure that information gets out appropriately becomes, you know, slightly more difficult. Community members, in terms of being in the community, you've got the idea that you shouldn't be making decisions for people. Okay, so your community members that you're making decisions for, you should be talking to. And that could be, you know, individuals in the disability community. This could be farmers or folks who just, you know, have a love of pets, you know, working with your local SPCA or animal shelter, you know, what is the plan? Or do you have people who come in because they foster animals and we can get information out to them, you know, trying to think of some of the non-traditional ways to go through stuff. Globalization as sort of the third topic area with the people. We've seen an increase in the length of commutes, okay? And this, I have a couple bullets here, both domestically and internationally. People commute longer distances and they also commute longer time. So this could be a drive time thing. For some areas, both in the US and abroad, people cross countries' borders to get to work. If anybody's seen it recently, I think the BBC was the one covering it, that Luxembourg, which is a small principality kind of stuck down between like Switzerland, I think it borders Austria as well. Basically, they have so many people coming into their little principality to work that they felt that the commute was getting too long. And so they said, okay, we're going to make public transit free to everybody, which is great, except when you've got people potentially coming long distances, one, do they know what hazards they're facing in the area that they're in? you as an emergency manager, if something happens, are you going to help get them back home? You know, are you prepared to handle people who basically wind up stranded? And then you've got folks who are traveling more for vacations, you know, back, I mean, before FEMA was enacted in, you know, in 1979, I mean, a big trip might have been going to grandma's house 50 or 100 miles away. And not that people didn't travel, but I mean, air travel, cruise travel, those were for the upper echelons of society. Nowadays, people travel for everything. I went ahead and put the Disney World versus Disneyland picture on this one because, you know, if you're trying to find a minivan during the summer, these are the two places that you probably need to check because they're all parked at one of these two places. But you know, you've got families who will travel thousands of miles for a week at one of these places. Chances are they're not from California or they're not from Florida. I mean, at the point that Disney World, while located in Florida, is roughly the size of San Francisco, I mean, that's a huge area to have to cover. You know, if there was an evacuation there, are you prepared to help get people out? And I mean, I think we've all seen some of the pictures when we've got like large scale evacuations happening. But tourism in general, so the picture on the left, that's actually a picture of the Delaware beaches, like Rehoboth Beach, which is very, very popular. And this brings in millions of dollars to the Delaware economy, people who come down just to go to the beach. And I can tell you from being down there during the summer that you're not just hearing English being spoken. And so again, people are traveling from thousands of miles away to come to the beach, whether it's for a couple of days or for a week. But I mean, globalization is a huge market. There's a huge and growing number of people who are traveling longer for work. Sometimes they're just traveling because they have more discretionary funds to do so. We've also seen an uptick in the number of domestic workers. And so this straddles the globalization concept and like the knowledge of the population, because in some places in the US, as well as internationally, we know that folks come from other countries via legal and illegal means to work sometimes as domestic servants, you know, so they work in housekeeping for a family, or they nanny, something like that. And we don't necessarily know, and we, being emergency managers, don't necessarily know that they're there, but we recognize it could be a problem. Because when we need people to leave somewhere because of an impending disaster, are we getting the information out correctly? Is it being disseminated right? And are people going to be willing to talk to us? Okay, I mean, if you're, especially right now, if you're here in the US and you're not here legally, you do not want to interact with any sort of law enforcement personnel because they're just, they perceive that there is going to be a risk to their ability to remain in the US. And so all of these are factors that we're constantly balancing. So as my final thoughts on this, because I think we're running up on time, some of these pictures, the one on the left is mine. So from the Great East earthquake and tsunami in 2011. I will get to that. The other two pictures I have where they were retrieved from. The middle picture of the fellows at the back of the truck was actually from Hurricane Andrew and some of the migrant population. And then on the right, that was Hurricane Katrina and some of the issues that the disability community faced. So kind of where are we and like where are we going with this from a people perspective? Right now, we have a very complex situation that we are trying to deal with an imperfect solution, okay? There is no 1 + 1 = 2 on some of these problems and solutions. What happened for one event might not necessarily work for a second event. You know, we have to recognize that while we're trying to have an all hazards approach, kind of regardless of the funding, sometimes the money dictates what our focus happens to be. But we need to continue to keep the people and situations that we might be called upon to answer in, like, top of mind. Obviously, folks with disabilities cover a very, very wide swath of the population, because regardless of what demographic you look at, there are people who might have, in disasters, increased need for services or resources. And so, do we have solutions? And even if that solution is knowing who to call, because that other person is going to have a solution, that might be the way to go. There's been a very large push since, I would say like the late 90s, early 2000s, to get people out of institutions living in communities, which means we can't ignore the people who are in our communities. Knowing who's there is going to be one of the best assets that you can have, because you've got, during that planning phase, during the preparedness phase, being able even to know which organizations are going to be able to get you into those communities is the way to go. Using the migrant community as an example, sometimes because people don't want to self-identify to levels of government, and that's usually where emergency management is, embedded in some sort of local or state government. There are organizations who can act as an intermediary. And so when you have messages that you need to get out, either on social media or on your website, being able to email some of your contacts to say, hey, something big's happening, or we're anticipating something big is going to happen. They might be able to pick it up and push it out because they're the trusted source. Having accessible messaging with whatever you do, this might be that you're using different modalities like social media, websites. There are ways that you could get in front of like a news station to do updates that way, but you want to make sure that it's as accessible as possible. And so there are ways to do alt text. And so if somebody hovers over a picture, or a screen reader is going to be able to go down your web page and pick out the important bits, you can embed that in some of your posts. You should also think about having, other languages in your communities identified, because that's going to help to serve people. You might need an American Sign Language interpreter if you go in front of a media for a press conference. There's a way to do that right. People in your community would help you identify that. If you have additional questions for me, like at the end with some of that, feel free to drop me an email. With some of the accessible messaging as well, like colors can make a big difference. And so if you think it looks really good, sometimes it doesn't, because it's difficult for people to read who have low or no vision. Tapping into people in your community, like, get creative with this. If you're worried about tourism, sometimes there's a hotel or motel, like a group of individuals through like the Chamber of Commerce who might meet. They might be able to help you put information up, especially if you have times of the year where you have a lot of tourists coming in to your communities, because we know tourism is a huge industry. Looking at what's happening right now with the coronavirus, airlines are taking a huge hit. But that means that, that's a data point to know that if people were flying right now, because you can contextualize the monetary difference. It's like, although this is what we're losing, there's an argument to be made that people are on the move, and are we going to be able to serve them where they are, once they get to our jurisdiction? And don't always ask for stuff with some of these organizations that you're trying to kind of tap into. Sometimes it's saying, hey, what could we help you with? Or we have something that we think you might be interested in. And so, in the community I used to work with, Smart 911 was something that everybody had. And we tried to bring that up as a potential option for people, because it's good, 365 days a year. for all sorts of personal emergencies, not just disasters. And then sort of as a final wrap up with what's happening right now, especially with the coronavirus, we have an opportunity to really work across departments to help individuals, because sometimes not only are we amplifying the message, okay, but sometimes the other departments know the audiences even better, and they might have better connections. And so right now, working with health departments who already see some people due to the services that they provide, this might be a great time to work with, public health in terms of messaging, or, this is other information that you might want to have. And, to do it and do it with fidelity is important, and it can be time intensive, but when you find stuff that works and you have your network established, I think it's very, very doable, because we've definitely moved from, we're going to tell you what you need to do, to a much more of a, let's meet you where you are, and recognize that you have so much capacity. Emergency managers and the agencies have so much capacity. What do we need in the middle to bridge, the final gaps there? I think people are much more aware of how things can go badly. And so there is more recognition from a personal preparedness standpoint that it's like, you can't just necessarily wait to the last minute. I mean, some people don't try to wait to the last minute, but due to where they are in their own situations, sometimes that's what happens. As we move away completely from, preparedness with people, I think from an agency perspective, we are recognizing that in the recovery process, it takes quite a bit of time. And as we make sure that we're trying to meet people and bridge these gaps, it's like, do we have solutions that are going to help maintain people's independence? Can they get back to their normal day-to-day operations just as quickly as possible? And are we building it back better than it was before? And that was actually part of why I put the picture on the left on there with like the ramp. When they did in Japan, the disaster housing, at first they didn't have any ramps, and they realized, oh my gosh, we're inadvertently stranding people in their homes because they can't get out. They can't go up and down the steps. And so for the elderly or for individuals in wheelchairs, this was an easy fix. They listened to residents and they started putting them in different blocks of buildings. And that went a really long way for people to kind of get back to normal. So with that, I will say thank you very much for the opportunity to speak and try to talk about, where we've been with some of the people and some of the structures that have been in place. And if anybody has any questions, I'll take them now.
Okay, thank you so much. We do have a few people in the room here with me at the CDRE, so I'm going to open it up for questions for everybody while people are thinking of questions, because I know a couple people in the room here have a few questions. If anybody else has questions, you can either type it into the chat box or raise your hand. I'll get started off though. So one quick question for both early career professionals and for students. What recommendations do you have for internships or even first jobs in the sector that are working across different departments like you discussed today?
I would say it kind of depends on where you are. If you have the ability to build in some sort of internship, because I get that everybody has their own to pay, reaching out to your local emergency management division or department, sometimes it's embedded under like emergency services, reaching out to them, they'll sometimes work with you, especially with like bridging the gap between, say, emergency management and public health. We had folks who had like a foot in each department, because the great thing about internships is that you can sometimes help mold your own with what you want to do. And so I would just say reach out. I mean, the worst they're going to say is no, but I know of no organization right now who would not be incredibly grateful for another set of hands, especially if you spelled out in the beginning, I want to work either with you, or do you have a recommendation for working with these other departments? Amber, did that answer your question? Because if it didn't, or you want more detail.
No, I think that's great.
Okay.
I think just something for people to go off of, because I know a lot of times, especially with the dual degree program here with social work, a lot of times people are looking for resources. And so just having like that first step, I think is really helpful. So thank you. Are there any other questions from anyone? Okay, I'm gonna mute mine and we'll have another one in this room.
Hey Rochelle, it's Austin. I just want to ask, since you know a lot about the social field of emergency management, where do you personally see that growing in the future with emergency management, and what do you think like should be something that grows?
I mean, this is probably a bit of a broken record, but I think with some of the growth, especially for like the people and like the social end of things, is that we need to get back to some of the relationships. Where I've been both geographically and okay, let me step back. Like where I was when I did my emergency management, like kind of embedded work, it seemed that there had been a great deal of turnover. And I can't speak to that in other places. But I would imagine everywhere, like, people stay for a few years and then they leave, or you have a really big champion for a little while and the person moves on to a different job. I would say going back to some of those relationships that were there. That said, it's also really difficult to do because honestly, without a disaster, people no longer have that on their radar. And so they wind up turning their attention to something else. And so sometimes just getting back to calling someone up and saying, hey, don't forget about me. Do you want to go out and get a cup of coffee? Is in certain cases like the best thing that you can do.
Perfect, thank you. So I don't see any other questions. I just want to wrap up one more time saying thank you so much for your expertise and just taking some time out today to discuss from the social work perspective and from the vulnerable population perspective what the future of our field is going to look like as we continue forward. I do want to let everyone know that since this is recorded, if you want to share it with anyone or rewatch it, you can do that. It'll be posted on the website, so millersville.edu/CDRE. It'll also be posted on the Facebook page. So that is spelled out, Center for Disaster Research and Education. And it'll also be on the Twitter and Instagram pages, and that is CDRE_MU. And our next and last webinar for the semester is going to be towards the end of April on Wednesday, April 22nd with Dr. Heather Beal, who also is a Millersville alum and doing some great work. So we hope to see you guys and hear you guys back then. And until then, thank you very much and have a great day.
Thanks so much, Amber.
Bye, thanks.
Bye.